Thanks everybody for being here. This session is titled The Leadership Pivot for Rebels and Renegades, a walkthrough of building your business. So I'm really excited about this. Curt is just amazing, and I'm proud to be a Brink advisor with him. He's great people and a lot to share. So without further ado, Curt, do you mind advancing the slide?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. And we are being recorded. So like I said, the pivot sessions are really, something that that the Brink wanted to provide to you to really think about with kind of the changing world around us. What are things as entrepreneurs and business owners, things that we need to navigate? And so every week we're doing a different topic. These sessions we are putting out on YouTube, and we'll be making sure to get you a link to that. So if you want to go back and see any of the sessions or share them, you can do so along with the slide content. So we wanted to make this available to as many folks as possible. And we also, like I said, want to make this interactive. We want to get your thoughts and get your feedback and questions. So feel free to use the chat as we go ahead and kind of launch into the session to ask questions. I'll be monitoring that to make sure that Curt gets a chance to answer your questions as we go. Also, feel free to go off mute and ask questions as well during the session. It's fine too. All right, so without further ado, next slide,
absolutely.
please, Curt.
So I have my, I'm just looking at the slideshow. So if there are any chat questions that come up, Lauren, just bring them up.
You got it. Cool. All right, and I'd love to introduce you, Curt. Do you mind switching to the next slide, please? All right. Actually, I'm going to have Curt talk about the Brink, but here we go. All right, so Curt is a pioneer in his own right. When it comes to life sciences, he really is an amazing advisor for us. We're lucky to have him on the team. In 1981, he was the co-founder of Applied Biosystems, which is the original genomics tool company. And Curt was really at the forefront of the genomics tools business. As you can kind of read along with me here, really did a lot in that space, and also with DNA sequencing. He also co-founded in 2013 Molecular Assemblies. And after being cured from cancer, I think lung cancer in 2017, Curt joined the Brink team as the life science advisor through this program. And we're really lucky to have him. As I said, he is humble and thoughtful and always inspiring, and I love hearing from him. I'm so glad he took on this topic because I think he has a lot to share. So without further ado, Curt Becker.
Well, thank you, Lauren. And yeah, I'll just add, as being a genomics guy, genomics, it makes me very broad, but very shallow in life sciences, in that, agriculture people use genomics, and diagnostic people, drug development, forensics, anthropology. So I get a glance of all of these different industries, but I'm not an expert in any of them except for the genomics things. That being said, I'm happy to, really happy to be here working with so many great companies that are a part of the Brink. And I like the term rebels and renegades. That's something that Misty uses often, because the people I work with are, heavy risk takers. They're putting everything on the line to try to do something that nobody's done before. And that's really an exciting place for me to be. And, one of the things that we'll talk about later is culture, the kind of culture that you're going to develop with your company. And one of the cultural aspects of the Brink that I really admire is this penta-bottom line, which you'll see on the bottom line of this these paragraphs is, profit, people, planet, peace, and prosperity. And we can work towards all of these as we build our businesses and grow economic activity and create jobs. So, so you can read the quote here, but if you don't know who you truly are, you'll never know what you truly want. And so that's where I'd like to start, is really talking about who are you. I was going to play a little bit of the who video on that, but that looks like it's going to be way too complicated, so we won't go there. But one of the things that you're going to find as you build a company is really figuring out who you are, and being able to communicate that to your colleagues, to your investors, to the people you hire, to the partners you deal with, and everybody who's important to you in your life. And I've found that I've been working on this with a lot of my clients lately, and communicating, that emotional tie to their business is not something, at least life scientists and probably engineers are all that good at doing. So, if you look at a typical pitch deck, for instance, we might have 5 or 6 different pictures of, our co-founders, of some of the advisors that we work with, and we have all these statistics about, I've been at MIT professor for 13 years, which is all impressive, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the person. So I don't think anybody really cares. I had to learn that the hard way because I had one of those slides, and it took a lot of time to present it. And I don't think you can see people's eyes rolling back in their head. Nobody really cares about these kind of statistics. So you can take it to the next step, and let's think about what you worked on. And we can say this and that and the other thing, and all the projects that we've worked on throughout our career. And I think still no one really cares about, what you've worked on. Now, if you talk about what you've accomplished, and let me there's a dichotomy here. I'm an old guy. I'm a boomer. So I've got a history. I've got experience. Younger people, I think, have to look more forward in terms of what they want to accomplish and show some passion behind, what you're trying to perform and what you're trying to do. But, what I really want to hear, and you don't have to be explicit about this in your pitch deck, but tell me what you're proud of, how you changed the world, or how you intend to change the world. Now tell me what made you, what makes you passionate. Again, that doesn't necessarily have to be on a slide, but you better be ready to say it and have your 30-second pitch at a moment's notice. Have it memorized and ready to go. And now I'm starting to care. Now I'm starting to understand more about you and whether I want to do business with you or not. Okay, so I'm going to pick an example here, and I don't know if Beth is here. Are you here, Beth? Maybe. Anyway,
I'm here.
Hi, Beth.
Hi.
So on Beth's original pitch deck, we had this little black square that I cut out where, co-founder, CEO, and CSO, precision medicine, oncology, government relations. And I had the privilege of starting to work with Beth probably 2007. Is that about right? Anyway.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and really, we started working together again. We had a big gap in our relationship, but we started working together again when I joined the Brink. And to tell you the truth, I'm going to say it was like pulling teeth, trying to understand the amazing contributions that Beth Ann has made to science. And so I want to go through some of those because we got there. And so, for instance, she could say, I worked at University of North Carolina. Cool, okay. And she got a master's degree there. But she worked on something that nobody knew about at the time. Now we understand, like with the coronavirus, when it attacks you, it takes over the machinery of your cell so it can replicate itself. We didn't know that when Beth Ann started in this scientific field. And she was a pioneer in that. And it's led to great understanding of how we are going to deal with virus infections and how they work. One of those was cytomegalovirus and its effects on birth defects, which, again, we didn't know about that when Beth first started in this field. From there, she went on to get a PhD at Scripps. And she was looking at what's called checkpoint pathways. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but again, she was a pioneer. And this is going to be a $30 billion industry by 2023. and Beth was a pioneer in that industry. And it doesn't come off, it didn't come off immediately when you talk to Beth. And it's just an amazing accomplishment of what she did. Now, when I met Beth back in 2007, her son had just been diagnosed with a childhood cancer. And the way, you know, the whole idea of cancer treatment is to stop cell division. And that's fine for an adult like me when I went through chemo and radiation and things like that, because, you know, almost all the cell division that's going on is on the tumor. But for a child, that's a disaster. It stops their development. It arrests their development, and leads to developmental problems probably for the rest of their life. And basically, Beth Ann worked with the doctors and came up with a way to treat her son, Nicholas Connor, in a way that would not arrest his development. You can see a picture of him here, you know, winning a bicycling award. And this was really a first step in what's now called personalized medicine or precision medicine. And you know, that's a whole industry now. In fact, I went to a meeting in January called Precision Medicine World Conference or World Congress. And about 2 years after that, I saw an article on a Time magazine where they talked about a woman who had done pretty much exactly what Beth had done 2 years earlier, and talked about this was amazing. Beth was another pioneer in precision medicine. Okay, follow that to working with a company called Caris, which predated Foundation Medicine. We can talk about Foundation Medicine was bought for about $3.5 billion from Roche. And they actually sequenced my tumor. And it turns out that we know now cancer is definitely a disease of the DNA. And by understanding the genetics of a tumor, it gives us some idea of how to treat it properly. From there, Beth went on to lobby Congress. She figured out how to get them to start funding childhood cancer projects. She got the Department of Defense interested in funding young people's cancer research. She's gone to 3 years of presidential briefings. She's involved in the Cancer Moonshot. And now she's formed a company in telemedicine, again, a pioneer, and which is now merged with another company to become Tigo Health. So my point in all this is that it's really important to understand who you are and what you've contributed or what you want to contribute in the future and map that out. Okay, so let's move on. After doing such, you know, it's time to start developing a vision. And if you're working in a company, let's say with 2 other coworkers, this is something that you have to do together. You can't do this alone. Unless, of course, you're a solopreneur. But so I looked at 2 different companies and how they state their vision. Finca is an interesting company. It's actually a not-for-profit that I got interested in maybe the early 90s. And what they were doing is giving microloans to women in developing countries. And they said 95% or 98% of these microloans are paid back. And it might just be a bicycle, money to buy a bicycle for deliveries, or a little stove to have on the side of the road to make bread for lunches for, you know, people in the community. But their vision, as you can read here, is to build a global network of sustainable and scalable social enterprises that improve lives worldwide. The gentleman who started this not-for-profit went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics. Apple, their vision statement is, we believe that we are on the face of the earth to make great products, and that's not changing. So as you start to think about the vision that you want to establish for your company, and this is very important for the culture that you want to establish with your company, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It's important to think about this. There's a lot of definitions available on the internet and many, many tools to help you go about developing these vision statements. So the next step is something a little bit more specific than your vision, and that's a mission. Okay, what are you trying to accomplish? And so again, for FINCA, to alleviate poverty through lasting solutions that help people build assets, create jobs, and raise their standard of living. And for Apple, bringing the best user experience to its customers through its innovative hardware, software, and services. So let's think about Apple for a minute. They certainly do that. I mean, that's what they do. The mission doesn't only, it not only tells you what you want to do or explain what you want to do, by exclusion, it tells you what you don't want to do. So for instance, Apple probably doesn't want to go into the restaurant business, or you know, that's an extreme example. But when you have a defined mission, and you stay focused on that mission, it keeps your scope to a point where you don't start moving all over the map. I hope that makes sense, because that can really be confusing for a company to start losing their way by trying to do too many things and not doing anything well. So the values talk about, you know, we talked about the mission. Here's what we want to do. What kind of company do we want to be to carry that mission out? So again, and for instance, with FINCA, it's invest in the potential of people, nurture trusted long-term relations, serve beyond self. And I'll let you read the rest of that. And for Apple, accessibility, education. We know they do a lot for the the schools. Environment, inclusion, diversity, privacy, supplier responsibility, and these values now, again, they lead to developing a culture. And again, what I like about the Brink is this idea of the pentabottom line: profit, people, planet, peace, prosperity. That's part of the culture that we're trying to define. And one way or another, your company is going to develop a culture. And you're either going to do that purposefully, or it will just happen randomly. And I can tell you from personal experience, you don't want that to happen randomly. The leaders of a company should take responsibility to make sure that they're doing. For me, one of the biggest things about culture, which I see as branding, a lot of people think of branding in terms of a trademark or the colors that are used, or you know, the look of their website. But really, branding to me is more about culture. And one of the things that I tend to focus on is the stakeholder perceptions and the stakeholder value. Who are the stakeholders? Your customers, employees, investors, partners, community. And how do you balance maximizing the value for these 5 groups in a way that doesn't, you know, because you can say, well, if I want to prioritize my investors, you know, maybe I'll have to pay my employees less or charge my customers more than I should, or something like that. So how do you balance all these stakeholders? And this is just one of the cultural aspects that I like to look at as I'm working on building a company. So we know what we want to do. And now we know kind of the culture we want to develop to do it. So the next step is to start developing goals, SMART goals. What do we want to actually do? You know, so SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So for instance, one of the groups I'm working with is to create a new enzymatic DNA synthesis process that will lead to the ability to create polynucleotides up to 100 units long and with an accuracy of 99% within a year. Or another company introduced our new nutraceutical in 4 chain retail outlets across San Diego County within 6 months. So this, now you know what you need to focus on. To do that, and this is what I was originally thinking for this talk, is take a look at what's called a SWOT analysis, where you look at your team or you look at your company and assess what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are our opportunities that are out there and threats. So the strengths and weaknesses are internal to us. It has to do with our team and our financing and our facilities and our products. When I say facilities, can we manufacture? Can we, do we have enough money? How much money are we going to need? Things like that. And you can see that the same things that might be strengths in some aspects might be weaknesses in others. And I want to emphasize with most of these exercises, this is not for a CEO, founder to sit down for a half hour, crank out, and they're done. It will get more into process later. But, and then let's go to opportunities and threats. So these are more external. So, right now the economy is, who knows what's going on with the economy? There's so much ambiguity right now. And that could be an opportunity, certainly in the healthcare field. We were just talking, it probably is. In other fields, it's like restaurant business, or it's not, it's a huge threat. What is a competitive situation? That can be an opportunity or a threat as well. And by understanding the competitive situation in that manner, it might start telling us how we niche out certain market segments that might be more vulnerable, well, more available to our products than other market segments. You have to look at the regulatory environment. Again, as a life science person, if you're into diagnostics, you're into drug development, it's a heavy regulatory environment. And starting any business in California, there's a heavy regulatory environment. Some of those things might be opportunities. Some of them might be threats. And of course, you have to be dependent to some extent on partners. So how do we look at all those things? And we'll talk about process for doing this a little bit more later. So I think once we understand, our strengths and weaknesses, this is a business model canvas, it's called. And the first 2 things to look at are really the one in the middle called value proposition, and then the one on the right called customer segments, and start to get a balance between, listing out all these different customer segments in, let's say, in a restaurant business. We could be fast food, we could be sit down, we could be Mexican, we could be fusion, how does that all work out? And then creating value propositions around the particular segment that you would like to address. And there are a number of other aspects then once you start determining what your value proposition is for a particular segment. For instance, I'm going to use Redbox as an example on this. So if we look all the way to the left, who are their key partners? 7-Eleven, grocery stores, and what are the key resources they have? Well, the key resource they have is a bunch of CDs or DVDs and kiosks. And so you can, and what's their channel? Their channel is, to deliver through a kiosk. So there's ways to go about looking at how to build your business around your strengths and weaknesses and such. And that's where it says how to build a business model canvas. That's actually a link that will take you to a site on Udacity by Steve Blank. It's about a 10 or 11 hour course that he walks you through to take a look at this. Some of you may have heard of ICOR, which is a program where once you have this business model, you test it and you talk to a lot of potential partners and customers and things like that. And just ask them questions, not try to sell in any way, but just ask them questions about what you're doing and if they see any value in that. So don't be afraid to hit this link. It's definitely a worthwhile 10 to 11 hours to spend. So now you've got your business model. You know what kind of partners you need. You know what kind of products you want to develop. You know how you want to make money. And so it's time to put together the good old Gantt chart, which is going to show you the milestones, the timelines, when things, dependency between different sub-projects and such, so that now you know how to go about your work. So then who's going to do that work? What kind of competencies do you need? What kind of job descriptions? And I would recommend people build an org chart for maybe 6 months out, maybe 1 year out, 2 years out, and you'll get it wrong, and that's okay. You'll get all these things wrong at first. These are all experiments, but start thinking about who you need in what positions to get the job done that you defined in the business model. And finally, okay, so we know what we're trying to do. We're looking at the people that we need to do it. And so you want to develop a pro forma, which at the early stage of a company, I believe should be very simple. And one of my clients has told me that to use this as a tool costs her a lot of money because their pro forma is so complicated. They're looking at things like 3 years out what the depreciation is on their office furniture. You don't want to do that. Not yet. I mean, maybe when you're, a Fortune 500 company, or at least a public company. But I like to keep this simple. And the pro forma to me starts with the market size, and then and calculates the growth quarter by quarter. Usually, when I do pro forma, I do the next 4 quarters with the total year. The second year, 4 quarters again with the total second year. And then year 3, year 4, year 5 can just be year by year rather than going into quarterly detail. By this time, you should be able to calculate how much it's going to cost you to manufacture or produce the goods that you want to produce, so you can calculate gross margins. And although you may not know all of the costs involved. And I tend to like to keep these simple. And so at least as a first pass for the first year, maybe focus on the number of personnel you're looking at and multiply by a certain number. So for instance, I know Thermo Fisher, which is a huge company, probably 4 years ago, they would just multiply the number of people they needed by $350,000 each. And that's where they started their planning process. It's not where they finished their planning process, but that's where they started. And so again, if you're a life science company, your cost per employee is probably higher because there's a lot of supplies, equipment, and such that are going to go into that. If you're writing software, it will be, software people cost more than scientists in general, but don't have the same kind of equipment needs as scientists. So I don't have a good number for people in the tech industry, but those numbers are probably available somewhere, and we can help dig those out. So again, this is a forecasting tool. This is a tool to look at your business. If you look at the bottom line here, total opportunity, opportunity 1, opportunity 2. Opportunity 1 could be my business in the United States. But in year 2, I'm going to start trying to do business in China or Europe or something like that. Or it could be I have a new product coming out, and that's part of opportunity 2. Or it could be both. Opportunity 3 could be a little bit of both. So, and then, if you're somewhat skilled with Excel, you can set it up so you can come up with some numbers for your total opportunities over time. I hope that makes sense. And so finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about process. And again, this is not something the CEO should do in isolation, sitting down for a half hour on each one of these projects. I think most of these are team oriented, starting with vision. And I would suggest, if you're developing technology, most companies are going to have weekly meetings talking about, where is the R&D, where's the technology development at, and people get together and discuss that. I would recommend you have the same kind of meetings, probably 2 hours, 2 times a week, but it's really up to you. But get there should be minutes. So you do, or an agenda rather. You want to have an agenda. And even with times on it. So we're going to spend a half hour on this subject. We're going to spend a half hour on that subject. And who should the attendees be? And I think it really is different for the project that you're working on at the moment, and how big your company is and where you're at and things like that. So I tend to be pretty inclusive, maybe to a fault. I can definitely tell you times when there were a lot of people who didn't like what we were doing, and they would. I think they would like the outcome, but kind of throwing up some roadblocks in the process. So be careful about the attendees, but again, I tend to be very inclusive in that. Facilitation. I believe that all of these processes are better with a facilitator. Now, what is a facilitator? It's not an advisor. It's not somebody who's going to say, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. That's not facilitation. A facilitator asks really good questions. And when people, a team is going through this process and they're thinking about their business 24/7, maybe they start getting some tunnel vision. And a facilitator, by asking good questions, can help break down some of those tunnel vision barriers and get people to open their minds a little bit and start looking at things from a different perspective, which is really helpful and I believe really important. Okay, so you're done with the meeting. That should produce minutes. You should review, send it out to the appropriate people. Here's what we did in the meeting. Here's any decisions that were made. Here's any to-do steps that were assigned. And that turns into the next agenda for the next meeting, in this case, as proposed 2 weeks later or whatever that might be. And you want to keep up constant communications with the greater team, maybe people who aren't involved in the details of making the decisions in the meeting, but always keep your employees appraised of what you're thinking, because if you don't keep them appraised of what you're thinking, they're going to make it up. They're going to guess what you're thinking, and they'll probably get it wrong. So communications of how this process goes is very important. I want to point out that you don't have to do all this before you start your business. You can finish this process in 6 months or 9 months after you started your business. In fact, you definitely don't want to do it all before you actually go out there and get started. So a regular pace is good. And probably if it takes a year, when you're done, it's probably time to start the process once again, and to keep it fresh. And I noticed when I looked at Apple's mission statement, it's new. It's like 2 years old. So these things are not static. They need to be developed, and they're tools. They're tools that you use, and they need to be kept up to date. Okay, so that's it. I'm done for today. We can take some questions. I just will mention that Paul's on next week with, I guess you said you were changing the name of the pitch, actually, Paul. So I apologize for this, but, or changing the name of your meeting. But I'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Curt. Feel free, if anyone would like to ask a question, to go off mute. You're welcome to do that and ask. I'll also pay close attention to the chat if you'd like to ask there. I have one for you, Curt, to get us kind of started on some questions. You've founded a couple of different companies, and I'd love to hear just out of some of the things you walked us through today, using a SWOT, setting up mission, vision, values, establishing communication process. What to you was the biggest lesson in kind of using these tools? What was maybe most important or kind of your biggest takeaway out of how your leadership style or how any of this was important to you?
Yeah, well, I think understanding your customer is probably the most important thing. So, and just to give you an example, when I took over the DNA sequencing project as product manager, we had 25 installs, and most of them were Nobel laureates or on their way to becoming Nobel laureates, and 20 of them wanted their money back. And it wasn't, there were problems with the technology, definitely, but nobody knew what they were getting into when they bought this. This completely changed the nature of how a laboratory would have to go about their daily work, and so most people looked at it as a monstrosity that just got in the way. Then I had one guy who, pretty famous San Diegan. He was in Bethesda, Maryland at the time. His name is Craig Venter, and he was like cranking away. Just give me 20 more of these things, and because he got the idea, it wasn't just a tool to do a one-off here and a one-off there. It was a monster that needed a dedicated group of people working on it, and you couldn't just walk up one person one day and another person the other day, and things like that. We didn't understand that when we put it out. So that was a big important tool, and I think also looking at the pro forma and how are we spending our money, and yeah, kind of the whole process, actually. They're pieces of a puzzle.
Thanks, Curt. Anyone want to go off mute and ask Curt a question? Feel free to do so now.
I guess I bored everybody to death.
You gave us a lot of homework. I think everybody's working on their SWOT.
It won't be wasted time.
Hey, Curt, it's Beth Ann. So I am blushing right now. So thank you for running through my story. And I have to say that, everything you presented today is spot on. There are challenges that I have had, and Curt's helped me work through them. The process was one particular thing. Getting the whole team together on a regular basis, having a meeting. I would actually use Zoom and then record the meetings, and then run the Zoom through a program called Otter AI, and it would form a transcript of the Zoom meeting, and then I can edit it down, make it really easy, and then use that as almost like an accountability of what we talked about in the meetings, and provide that with the next agenda. I found that to be really helpful because we can go back to past meetings and see where, what maybe the barriers are, why hasn't progress been made in one area versus another, and just keep adding that, and also add behind the agenda going out for the next meeting would be the action items that were derived directly from that transcript. So that was very helpful. And all that was because, you know, Curt suggested, based on his experience, what he found to be very productive for his teams in the past. So I don't know if that helps anyone with their project management, but it helped me.
Thank you, Beth.
Curt, this is Petros. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay,
I didn't hear your
cool.
name.
This is Petros.
Oh,
Can
hi.
you explain a little bit more about how branding is more of a cultural thing? How you had spoke on that?
Well, I think for me, branding is how your customers perceive you. And again, if it, just like with your team, if you don't communicate well, they're going to make it up. And so despite a trademark or despite a logo or the look and feel of your website, that's part of it. But to me, it's really how do my customers perceive me and my company? And I can tell you there were times my company, Applied Biosystems Incorporated, where people called us arrogant beyond imagination. So you have, you know, when you hear that, you know what you need to work on.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, okay. So anyway.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
Don't be sorry. It's all good.
And one thing I'll add, you heard Curt mention that Paul will be speaking next week on kind of communicating pivots to investors and the investor pitch. The week following that, we're actually having a guest speaker by the name of Greg O'Neill, and he's actually talking about branding. And I think some of the concepts Curt just talked about too is that branding is bigger than logos and colors. It really has to do with your culture and your values and who you are. And so just talked to Greg yesterday. I know that's what he's really digging into, and he has a really deep background on some award-winning branding work with San Jose Airport, Southwest Airlines, and a number of other large companies. So excited to take that topic into one of these sessions coming up on the 23rd.
Yeah, Southwest Airlines is a great example. I mean, I can't even think of what their logo looks like offhand, but I know Southwest Airlines.
It's a big old heart. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, Curt. I have a question. My name is Kyle. I'm a new entrepreneur. Really nice presentation. Really informative. Thank you. Just kind of wondering about the kind of process of marrying the branding for your customers and the operational side. You know, you have, like you said, teams that are delving into the product development, the R&D, and then you have the actual selling side of the canvas, and kind of developing a product that your customers are actually going to buy and putting out an image that your customers will actually like. How do you marry those? What are your main?
I'm sorry, what was that last comment?
Basically, you have product development teams that are delving into the R&D, developing a product, right, on one side, and then on the other side, you have the image to your customers, and developing a product that your customers will actually want to buy and use. So basically, the product development and the sort of sales aspects. How do you typically marry those in the R&D phase? Is it surveys, interviews, just talking to customers, kind of constantly reassessing your product fit? Like, what are your main strategies?
Yeah, I've never liked surveys because I know I can't write a survey that isn't self-serving. There's always going to be a bias in any survey that I write, or probably anybody else in the company writes. I don't like surveys personally. And I think most people are kind of tired of them, to tell you the truth, since there's so many now compared to, let's say, 2 decades ago. But that business model canvas link that will be posted, I guess. Yeah, you can copy it, but I don't know how easy that is to do on. Anyway, that tells you how to do that. That tells you how to do that. I think in the general sense, what I like to do is, as a manager, I like to communicate down, keep everybody, under my leadership. I like to keep everybody informed of what's going on. I like to keep all of my, let's say I'm a director of whatever. I'd like to keep people at the director level in manufacturing and finance and R&D and sales and things, informed of what I'm doing and learn about what their priorities and goals are. And then I look up to my boss and, what are their priorities? What do they want me to do? So if they set goals for themselves, now how do I set goals for me? How do I set goals for, the people who report to me? How do they set goals for the people who report to them, et cetera, et cetera? So all those things should be aligned. Is that close to answering the question?
I guess another way, I didn't do a very good job of asking the question, I apologize. Probably a more succinct way to ask it is just, how do you develop a product in R&D that's actually going to sell?
Well, that's the link to the business model canvas.
Okay.
And that takes a lot of work. And I mentioned ICOR, which is kind of born out of the business model canvas, where you go out and survey customers and test. But you have to do that in conversation, not by a survey, because once you get into a conversation, people start talking, and you want to have a lot of freedom in the conversation rather than 1 to 10 scales or yes or no questions and things like that. Allow people to be creative in the conversation and say things that you might not have thought of asking them.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Curt?
I just have a general comment. This is Vicki. I have a new company, Explore STEM, and I actually pulled out some of my old notes because I scheduled a meeting tomorrow with Lauren because I feel so unfocused. And with COVID, we're in the homeschool education space, which that education space has changed dramatically. And I really appreciated your presentation because it's all the tools that I've been taught in various classes and through ICOR, and needing to kind of go back to my tools of what's the big vision and what goals arise from that vision, and thinking more. I think the COVID kind of put me in more of a panic mode, and what do I do today? But now thinking, well, what do we want to look like 3 years from now, and what's the path we need to take to get there? So I thought it was really very useful and helped focus my mind more on a long list of things to do than any specific questions.
Vicki, thank you for that. Thank you for that, because I think education will be one of the things that becomes most disruptive going forward. And I think you have a great opportunity, but who knows what's going to happen. So
Right, it's changing daily, literally.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like we found out the public schools are looking at a 10% decrease in enrollment right now, which their word and my word, that's catastrophic for them from a funding point of view.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. I'm excited to meet with you very soon. Hey, Curt, Benton just asked you a question. He said, great stuff. And he also asked you, how often should a company revisit their mission statement?
Well, let's look at revisit in two different ways. Bring it up in meetings, post it around the company, keep it fresh in people's mind. I think that's important. Actually, I guess it depends on how fast you're moving. So for instance, Applied Biosystems, when I was there, we started out with 2 products, and within about 5 or 6 years, we had, I don't know, 4 or 5 big products that were equipment as well as reagents and things that went into chemical processes in the equipment. So I guess, when you're looking at a new product development, first you want to say, does this fit within our mission? And maybe the mission has to be changed at that point to be expanded to look at something a little bit newer. But it will really depend. I think for a tech company, it's probably a lot more often because things move a lot faster.
Curt, I'm thinking back to something you highlighted earlier when we looked at values. And I think one of the example companies focused on diversity and inclusion as a key value. I'd love to, yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from you and your experience, in terms of leading these life sciences companies. How important was diversity and, diversity of thought in particular to what you were working on? And can you think of an instance where that was key in making you successful?
I just tried to be diverse, and it turns out it's really strange. I don't know how this happens, but for instance, when I was a sales manager, all my salespeople were women, and I used to, and people would laugh about that or make comments about that. But every time I hired somebody, I tried to look for a different skill set. So some of my salespeople were really good at prospecting. Some of them are really good at closing. Some of them were very technically oriented. And so what I tried to do is say, what's a skill set that I really want to plug a hole on? And I'd get a bunch of resumes and I'd go through them. And it seemed like the one that always came to the top was a woman. And and my boss was a woman as well. And I don't know that there was any reason for that except it was random, but I don't know. So I've always had more women in my groups, and I think I have more women clients right now than I have men. I have no idea why. My second hire at my last company was an African-American woman. And so it's important to me to have diversity, I guess. And but I do like your question about diversity of thought. I am, certified to administer the Myers-Briggs and a DISC personality assessment that I like to have people with different skill sets around in my group. So that helps me do that.
Thanks. Any other questions from anyone? All right, and we are at the top of the hour. Curt, I want to thank you so much for presenting today and answering questions.